Hey everyone, my name is Forrest, and today we're going to do a video on how to set up your brand new camera and get it taking great photos as quickly as possible. Let's dive in. Before we start, I need to get a few quick disclaimers out of the way. Number one, this video is designed for completely new camera users. If you're an intermediate shooter or an advanced shooter, you're going to garner very little from this video. But if you just opened your camera out of the box, you've been using your phone for years, and you want to get up and running as quickly as possible, this is for you. Number two, I'm not going to talk about every setting on your camera. That would be a 2-hour long video. We're going to go from zero to getting good pictures as fast as we can. Number three is that I'm going to be using a Canon R6 Mark II for this tutorial, but everything I talk about can be carried over to any make and model of camera. I would recommend though getting out your camera manual or pulling it up online, so if I mention something that's not quite in the same spot on your camera, you can look it up and find it. And finally, down in the description is a text version of this video, a little cheat sheet, a little quick start guide, whatever you want to call it. So you can check that out down in the description if you want to follow along or bring that with you out in the field so you don't have to watch this video again and again. I want to start by talking about the outside of the camera and the different options we should get started first. So on the outside of the camera, the number one thing that we want to do is get our camera in the manual mode, M for manual. And you might be saying, Forrest, whoa, I'm a new user. Don't put me in manual. It'll be fine. There's going to be some easier things that we add to manual as we go throughout this video. So we want to make sure we're on M or manual. Number two, on your lens, there should be an AF/MF switch if you have one. We want to make sure we are in AF or autofocus mode. If you're in manual focus, that just means you have to twist the ring to focus your camera, and for a new photographer, it can be a little frustrating. Next, we want to make sure our camera is in photo mode and not video mode. So if you have a switch for that on the outside of your camera, make sure you are in the photography mode. Next, we want to go ahead and put in a fully charged battery and a nice memory card. Now, I do want to make a couple notes on memory cards. First off is that memory cards should be purchased from a reputable company. This one here is from one of my favorite companies, ProGrade Digital. But don't go to the store and buy the cheapest memory card you can. This is where your images are going to be stored, and I do see a lot of folks get corrupted memory cards, which ends up ruining the images on the card or making them very difficult to recover. I've left some links to my favorite memory cards down in the description. Additionally, we're going to talk about formatting a memory card later on in this video, so we will be revisiting memory cards briefly at that point. So now that we have the settings on the outside of the camera set, let's dive into the menu and talk about a few key menu options. The first menu option I want to talk about is your image quality. And one of the biggest choices you can make as a photographer is whether to shoot RAW or JPEG. The way that I like to think about this is this. JPEG photos look better out of the camera. Like if you just take a JPEG right out of the camera, you post it to Instagram, it's going to look good. It's going to have contrast, saturation, detail, all that good stuff. RAW photos are not going to look as good out of the camera, but they give you more editability, meaning if you bring them into a program like Adobe Photoshop Lightroom, you're going to have a lot more room or latitude to drag the sliders further on a RAW photo than you will a JPEG. So I'm going to leave this decision up to you. I'll tell you, don't shoot RAW if you don't want to edit, and also don't shoot RAW if you don't have means of editing a RAW file. So you do need a program like Lightroom or Capture One or something like that to edit those RAW files. And that's why for most beginners, I do think JPEG is probably the right choice. But if you are on a path toward eventually wanting to become a photographer, right, whatever that means to you, then RAW might be something to get used to in the beginning. On my camera, I'm going to go up to image quality here, and I'm going to set it to RAW. I will also note that you can set it to RAW and JPEG, where it will shoot two pictures every time you push the shutter button. It'll shoot a RAW and a JPEG, and that could be a good thing to explore if you're not really sure which option is right for you. The next thing I want to talk about is ISO or ISO. ISO controls your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. Essentially, the higher your ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to light, and you can shoot in dimmer environments. The problem with a higher ISO is though, while it does give you more sensitivity, it also gives you something called noise. And noise is kind of this grainy speckliness that really looks pretty bad in your pictures. Here's the problem though. when you're just getting started, there's too many things to think about. So what I'm gonna recommend is that we actually set our ISO to auto. We let the camera pick. So we're gonna be using manual mode. I like the manual mode on the camera, but we're gonna use manual mode with auto ISO. We're gonna let the camera choose a suitable ISO for the situation. And again, we're just setting settings right now. We're gonna walk through the whole workflow of, okay, I'm in the scene, I'm shooting, how do we actually do things once everything's been set properly? So on this camera, I'm gonna go into my ISO speed settings. Again, this could be a little bit different camera to camera, so check your manual for ISO or ISO. And inside of ISO, I'm gonna set my ISO speed to auto. Additionally, if you have an ISO speed range or an auto range, set it to the maximum it can be set to and the minimum it can be set to. We wanna give our automatic ISO the maximum range of ISOs to choose from to ensure we get properly exposed or not too bright, not too dark images in as many situations as possible. The next thing that we're gonna wanna set is something called your metering mode. So in your manual, look up metering mode. And the metering mode we wanna use is whatever smart metering your camera has. So every brand's gonna call this something a little bit different. Canon calls it evaluative, Nikon calls it matrix, most other brands call it zone or smart metering. So when you're looking at your metering modes, you're looking for what I just said. I'll put up a little diagram here on the screen of what the icons look like depending on the camera brand. In this case, I'm on a Canon camera, so I'm gonna go into my metering mode selection and I'm gonna make sure I'm on evaluative metering. All this means is when you're shooting, the camera, when it goes to pick the right ISO for the scene, it's gonna look at the entire picture and it's gonna be able to judge much more precisely where that ISO should be set on one of these smart metering modes. The next thing that we need to set is something called white balance. White balance controls the colors in the photograph. And sometimes you might take images that are a little bit too blue or a little bit too orange or a little bit too green. They'll have a certain color hue to them. Now, my white balance recommendation depends on whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG. So if you decide that you wanna be a RAW shooter, you wanna edit your photos, you wanna put them on the computer or on your phone using something like Lightroom, then I would recommend RAW shooters set your white balance to daylight. Daylight doesn't add any sort of extra color to a photo. So if you're shooting in a very blue environment, say like dawn or dusk, your images will look blue. The camera's not gonna be doing any correction. With JPEG, however, I would recommend that you put yours on auto or you actually set it to the type of light you're shooting under. So as an example, in my white balance settings here, I have an option for tungsten lights. If you have that warm kind of like standard screw-in light bulb or fluorescent, you would set it to the scene. Or again, JPEG folks, if you don't want to worry about it, you could set it to auto. Now, the reason I recommend RAW shooters use daylight is because when we're shooting RAW, we can edit our white balance after the fact in post-production. So daylight is a starting place, and then we can go into Lightroom or whatever program we want to use and actually tweak the white balance to get the result we're looking for. So TLDR of that whole section, if you're shooting JPEG, I recommend auto or remembering to set it to the lighting in the scene. If you're shooting RAW, I recommend daylight and then seasoning to taste in whatever editing program you use. All right, our final thing in the menu is talking briefly about formatting your memory card. Memory cards, like I said, have a tendency to get corrupted. And one of the best ways we can prevent that corruption is by regularly formatting them on the camera we're gonna use them with. Now, I wanna give a big warning because formatting is a weird word. Formatting means erasing all of the data that's on the card. So do not format a memory card that has pictures on it that are not somewhere else and preferably backed up somewhere else. We have lots of YouTube videos on our channel covering backups and how to ensure you have a good backed up workflow. However, if you do have your images somewhere else and they're backed up, it is very healthy for a memory card to be formatted in the camera you are about to shoot photos to with that card. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into my menu. Again, this is something you can look up on your camera manual. I'm gonna go to where formatting is on a Canon, which is under this little wrench here. I'm gonna go to Format Card, and I'm going to format it. And again, this erases all of the data and it sets the card back kind of to like its factory defaults, but it also puts some nice things on the card that get it ready to work with this specific camera. All right, now we have everything set. Now let's look at the workflow for how to actually take pictures with these new settings we've just configured. The first decision we need to make is how much depth of field we want in our images. Now I'm using fancy photographer terminology. All depth of field is how sharp is the background in your photo relative to your subject. And I'll throw a couple examples on the screen now. Usually for portrait images, we want very shallow depth of field, minimum depth of field, so that just the person is sharp and the background is blurry. For landscape images though, we usually want a lot of depth of field. We want to get sharp in the foreground and sharp in the background. For most beginners, I recommend starting with shallow depth of field or minimum depth of field, not a lot. So this takes a little bit of pre-visualization, right? You got to kind of see in your mind's eye what you want the picture to look like. But once you have that visualization, then we need to pick a number, an f-stop, that will give us the resulting depth of field we're after. Now, f-stop and aperture are two things that a lot of photographers use interchangeably. So don't get confused if I use one and someone else uses the other. But essentially, it's very simple. F-stops are numbers. The lower our number, the shallower our depth of field will be. And the higher our number, the more depth of field we will have. So just think, portraits, we want a low number, and landscape, we want a higher number. So on the back of the camera, very simple. Right here, I've got a number with the F in front of it. That is my f-stop. If I spin this dial on the back, and every camera is going to be a little different on which dial you spin. Some cameras you might need to push a button and spin a dial. But when I spin this dial, you can see my f-stop changes. So your camera might not be able to go as low. You might only be able to go down to f4 or f5.6. That just means the lens that you have on is not capable of as shallow of a depth of field. But the point is, for portraits, when you want to blur the background, we go really low as we can with our aperture. And for landscape shots, when we want more depth of field, we go higher. If you kind of want like a general purpose walking around aperture, usually you would go lower than you would higher. Generally, photographers like that shallow depth of field as a kind of default level. So if you're just trying to set it and forget it, I honestly would just go to your lowest number or very close to your lowest number and leave it there. All right, that's step one. Step two is to set a shutter speed that's fast enough for whatever we're trying to do. Now, shutter speed's very simple. In the back of your camera, there's a shutter. The shutter opens to let light hit the sensor, and then the shutter closes. If the shutter's open for too long, think about it. If you're taking a picture and you have a really long shutter speed, if you're shaking and you're capturing light as you're shaking, you're gonna take a blurry picture, right? This is why a lot of photographers use tripods, because tripods stop your camera from shaking. So you can use a longer shutter speed. The shutter can be open for longer without any sort of camera shake. Another situation where you might want a really fast shutter speed, meaning that the shutter's open super quick, right, is sports photography. If you're photographing sports or wildlife or kids zipping around outside, right, whatever it is that's fast moving, you would want a faster shutter speed. So we want to pick a shutter speed that's a good fit for the situation that we're shooting in. So you might say, Forrest, well, what are some good ones? Well, number one, I've put some on the cheat sheet that I've linked down in the description, but let me give you the really quick, simple version. If you're shooting sports, fast-moving things, I would recommend a shutter speed of 1/1000th or 1/2000th of a second. If you're shooting portraits of someone and they are standing still, I would recommend 1/250th or 1/500th of a second. If you're shooting kids zipping around, you'd go faster, 1/1000th. If you're shooting a stationary subject, so just like a landscape, there's no wind, and you're trying to hold your camera as steady as possible, I would recommend a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. And then anything below 1/125th, slower than 1/125th, like a 60th or a 30th or a 15th or, a slower shutter speed than that, you're really gonna want a tripod, or you're gonna need a lens or camera with image stabilization. So do keep keep that in mind. Really 1/125th of a second, 125, that's gonna be as slow as I'm willing to hand hold the camera. And if there's anything moving in the frame, I'm gonna have to even go a little bit faster than that. Now here's the deal. If your shutter speed's too slow, guess what you're gonna get? You're gonna get a blurry picture. So don't try to live on the edge here. If you're unsure, go a little faster of a shutter speed than you think you might need. And number two, don't be afraid to experiment, right? If you need to kind of check and see, hey, is this shutter speed fast enough? Well, take a few pictures and then review them on your camera. And if they look a little bit blurry, it's probably because your shutter speed's a little bit too slow. Lastly, I'll say if you guys have ever seen those pictures with the pillowy water, the nice waterfalls with the pretty light and all the water and the pillowiness and the prettiness, those are very slow shutter speeds, like 5 seconds or 1 second or 10 seconds. There's no way to take a picture like that without setting your camera down on a rock where it won't move, or buying a tripod, or having something to stabilize the camera. Because you think about it, if you do a 10-second shutter speed and you're trying to hold the camera still for 10 seconds, no matter how still you try to hold, you're going to be shaking a little bit, and you're just going to end up with everything being blurry, not just the water. So we made a decision for shutter speed. Let's say we're doing a portrait image, so we want to aim for that 1/500th, 1/250th of a second range. So I already set my aperture. Now I'm going to set my shutter speed. So to do that, all I've got to do is twist a different dial on my camera. And again, check your manual for that. But we can see I can twist a dial and I can set my shutter speed. I'm going to set it to 1/250th of a second. So in photo speak, we would say, all right, we're at 1/250th at f4. F4 is giving us the depth of field that we want. 1/250th is giving us a fast enough shutter speed to stop motion in the scene. All right, the only thing that's left now is to take pictures. The nice thing is your ISO is set to automatic. It's just gonna deal with itself. So now it's just go take photos. I'm gonna take a photo of you guys right now. Go ahead and focus. Click the shutter, and there's a picture of the camera, and I can see it exposed it really well. It was a properly exposed image with a fast enough shutter speed. So everybody, that is your workflow, and that's gonna work in 90% of situations. There are gonna be a couple of gotchas, and I really wanna hone in on one here. You may be shooting and ending up with images that are far too dark. You follow my exact workflow, and still you look on the camera and the images are darker than they should be. If that's happening to you, ask yourself, how dark is the environment that I'm shooting in? I find this often happens in really dimly lit homes toward the evening time, or maybe you're shooting landscape pictures outside. Something in the scene is very dark, and you're seeing that on the camera. You're not getting properly exposed photos. Let me give you a quick example on why that happens. The thing we need to understand is, in photography, sometimes you can't win, and it's sad. It's just the way of life. As an example, let's say you're shooting a landscape picture outside and you want a lot of depth of field. So you decided to put your aperture or your f-stop at something like f22 or f32. Again, larger number means more depth of field. Additionally, you know you're hand holding, so you put your camera at 1/125th of a second. So you have a fast enough shutter speed and you have a good aperture. From what I told you in this video, you should be doing a great job, and you are. You're doing a perfect job. The problem is it's dark outside. It's early morning, it's late evening, and you're trying to get that last light in the sky. You go to take the picture and it's too dark. And the reason is because in order to get f32, which is, we didn't talk about this, but that's a really small opening in the lens. It doesn't let in a lot of light. And 1/125th of a second, which is a fairly fast shutter speed, you are stopping your camera from capturing much light. And in order to compensate, it has to raise up the ISO. And the problem is, when your ISO gets so high, there's actually an upper limit for how high it can go. And so you might run into situations where the camera is at its maximum. The sensor's as sensitive as it can be, and it's holding true to the two settings that you've asked it to do. And so the camera's only choice is to take a photo that's too dark. So in those situations, that's where consider adding more light to the scene. If you're shooting indoors, turn on some overhead lights. If you're shooting outside, this is why you might want a tripod. If you put a tripod under the camera, then instead of 1/125th of a second, you could slow down that shutter speed to maybe half a second or a quarter second to let in more light. I will say though, that's not gonna be most of the situations. So just kind of understand and take a second and be like, why is this too dark? What's happening here? Oh, it's because Forrest told me that in dimly lit situations, these settings might not work. And again, that's the trouble with a one-size-fits-all solution. This video is made for getting you going in most situations. There are some where you won't be able to. And that's what our other videos are for. Again, so you guys, if you wanna learn more, we have a lot of content that'll help you in those challenging situations. One other thing I want to mention is if you are getting images that are too bright or too dark and you're not in a very dimly or brightly lit situation, go in and check your something called exposure compensation. This is a little different on every camera, so I'm not going to get into the specifics of it on this one, but look in your manual for exposure compensation and be sure that it's set to 0, because exposure compensation will actually tell your camera that you always want to take photos that are too bright or too dark. It's a good tool to have as a more knowledgeable photographer, but as a beginner, it can just be super frustrating. All right, everybody, that sums it up. I hope you learned something. If you did, drop a like down below, hit subscribe to stay up to date with future videos, and let me know down in the comments if you have any questions. Truly, happy shooting. Enjoy your new camera. I realized my lens hood was on backwards this whole video. Don't hate me, every student I've ever taught before, if you saw this. Also, final note, everybody, if you have a lens hood, that's what this is, put it the right direction so the hood is protecting the front element of the lens. This is for sun flare. It's also for if you drop your camera, it hits the hood, not the glass on your lens. So final pro tip there at the end. All right, everybody, thank you. I'll catch you in the next one.